Hi, folks. Roage here. Going to provide the answers to the True American Patriot 101 final exam. I might offer a few little additional insights to maybe hint at some of the more advanced concepts. Most of the time, that sort of unsettles people, and because if you truly understand how this government sort of tricked us, then you find out exactly what's going on right now, and most people can't really deal with that because most people don't have a place of safety in which to entertain concepts that are unusual, foreign, and scary for them, like the truth. Okay, so let's just want to see if this is working. And it is. Okay. So I'm Roage, by the way, in case you haven't seen my face before. And let's get into the questions and let's start answering them. Now, people participated. It's generally not a large audience. People aren't beating a path to my door to learn the law and to learn what their true civic responsibilities are. That's going to make the maintenance of a lawful government problematic. Because it is the people, and primarily the people's true understanding of what their responsibilities are and duties are under a lawful republic, that maintains the integrity of the lawful republic. So if you have no idea what a civic responsibility is, I would suggest that you at least brush up on it. Now, in the original final exam video, there's a link down there to something called the Citizens Rule Book, Jury Handbook, and it is a wealth of information. It's a small little pamphlet, and it does provide most of what people know to at least be an American and certainly a patriot. A lot of these concepts are not taught in schools. They're no longer taught in churches, and they're no longer handed down from parents to children, and haven't for a long time, because there's an incredible source of power in that. So let me change things around here. See if it all works. Looks like it works. So let's begin. Okay. First question was, in the early U.S. Republic, what part or level of government was the responsible protector of rights under the Constitution? Okay. Now, Laurie Drabek came up with the correct answer, and that answer was the individual state governments. Okay, under the Union, under the Republic, rights were protected by citizenship within the state, because it comes right down to understanding what the difference is between a federation and a union. A union is a collection of several sovereign states, almost like mini countries, that get together and decide to form a government over that governs certain things between themselves. Now, that's a union. Now, remember, I used the word sovereign with respect to the state. In a federation, that sovereignty evaporates, and all of these states, and now what we have since 1871 is something called federal states. And federal states are not union states. They might be delineated geographic and political boundaries, but none of those federal states have a degree of autonomous sovereignty. So they all fall under the governing authority of the parent, in which case that is a parent. They are a subsidiary of the parent corporation that was created in 1871. Okay, next question. At the time of the U.S. founding of the U.S. Republic, what widely known power and responsibility of all Americans at the time was the primary means that allowed the people full control over laws enacted by their servant government? A hint: this is not in any way violent recourse. 2, this is not achieved through a petition of the government. And there's a note there, people are very nearly completely ignorant of this today. Okay? Now, these concepts were well known at the founding of the Republic. It was so well known and so widespread that they didn't even believe that they needed to include any of that in the founding documents. So it was pretty easy to conceal these elements if they weren't being handed down from parent to child, or weren't being taught in schools, or weren't taught in churches. So, here we have an incredible power that we forgot, and we have no representation in certainly within the media or television, or most things that we call nonfiction. This particular power isn't even mentioned. And let's get to the answer. The answer number 2 came from Goodwill Prevail, and he said, question number 2 is the power of the jurors not only to put the crime on trial, but also the law. And what that's called is jury nullification. And within a court of law, the jury not only has to decide whether or not a perpetrator violated the letter of the law, but they also have to decide whether or not they determined that law was fair. That law is something that 12 people would agree is something that the government should have the power to do, and whether or not the law is specific enough and unambiguous, okay, and doesn't contain some sort of error. Okay, so these were the responsibilities of the juror. Now, administrative and procedural courts right now frown on this, and there's a different reason for that. But this is primarily a function within the court of law. So a jury, if they don't like what the government cooked up, or the legislature cooked up, or what the president signed into law, they could basically say, we're not going to do that. And that law would just effectively be nullified immediately. Okay, and it really doesn't matter the size and scope of what the jury had within its power to nullify. Now, if you don't know that power exists when you serve on a jury, then you might just say, hey, well, the government says you can't do this, 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 and this, and you say, oh, well, hey, this guy did this, so obviously he's guilty. So, but as a citizen, that power, okay, and it takes really only one person on that jury, because one person can hang the jury. If one person says, no, that's not reasonable, I don't like the law, he can basically hang the jury. Okay, now you think about that. That's one person in this country that can literally stop a law from being enforced. Okay, that's an awesome power. And with that awesome power comes responsibility. And that responsibility comes through a knowledge of the law, and again, knowledge of what one's civic responsibility under a lawful government is. Okay? Again, if you look at the Citizen Rule Book, Jury Handbook, it talks about that in there. So jury nullification, normally they had a man in Denver handing out pamphlets and stuff regarding jury nullification at the district court there in Denver, and of course he got arrested, and there was a big stink made about that. But it turns out he had a right to do that. However, nullification all the time doesn't actually apply to a procedural or administrative court. It does apply in a court of law. Now, I'll get into a little bit more into the differences of those later. But a court of law, that pretty much went out the window in 1861. But I'll go into that here in a second. Next question. Why was the expansion of the Interstate Commerce Clause a criminal government overreach? I said, hint 1, how does the government derive its lawful and just power? And hint 2, the date this was enacted is extremely important. Okay, so the answer came from Lori Drabek. Yeah, she was really busy on this test, and she really got a lot out of this. And she answered quite a few of the questions, as you'll see. And I gave her a hint, and I said, well, what did the Act of 1871 do? And she answered, according to your I'm a Traitor video, articles of incorporation were filed under sovereign French law creating the United States of America in all capital letters, which is a corporation or fiction of law. Since a fiction of law does not have lawful power over a real man, they needed to trick to establish joinder, or tricking a man into binding himself to a corporate entity under the exclusive control of officers of the corporation. Using the law, your word is your bond. This Congress replaced the Union State, which is a subsidiary corporate federal state. Okay, now what is that? And then I said, is a colorable corporation a lawful entity? And she says no. Now, a corporation is a legal entity. Okay, it is an entity that is by its design not accountable, because it immunizes any of the officers within that corporation. It immunizes them from personal liability. Now that's great if everybody's okay with that. The problem is not having accountability gets kind of tricky when you start using that type of entity as a government. Well, why? Because that government as a corporation immunizes all the officers from personal responsibility. If you're wondering why, criminals are walking around free today, and officers of the government are walking around free, it's because they are immunized from personal responsibility. That's not a good thing, folks. Okay, that's not a good thing. Okay, you want your lawful government accountable to to the people who consent to be governed by it. Now, what happened in 1871 was, because in 1861 the southern states effectively nullified the republic by withdrawing their consent, because as we know, governments derive their just power by the consent of the governed. Well, if the people in the southern states withdrew their consent, was Abraham Lincoln still president? No. He took it on his own authority to declare martial law and marshal the northern troops against the South. Now, let's not. We don't even need to talk about the whole slavery aspect. Let's just talk about the fact that the states themselves at that point lost their sovereignty. And the problem during the Civil War, when Sherman went down there and just literally abused the civilian population to the point where, they were shell-shocked. That was criminal force. The other thing is those people did not consent when their state governments were installed for them. So if the settled law says governments derive their just power, their lawful power, by the consent of the governed, then then they had a problem, because they could not get the people of the South to voluntarily participate in the reconstructed Union, which was actually a reconstructed federation if you look at the architecture. So they didn't want to do it. So that sat around since 1861 to 1871, where they found an end around. He says, well, they went to sovereign France, because at that point the country of France was still sovereign, filed the Articles of Incorporation for an entity called the United States of America, all capital letters, corporation, right? A fiction of law. All right. So this fiction of law is governed because it is a commercial entity. It's governed under Admiralty Law, the law of the sea. The Constitution is the law of the land. But if you redefine your government as an entity of maritime law, of commerce, then you need the entities underneath that also have to be defined that way, because a fiction of law cannot apply to anything real against that real man or woman's will. So they had to create subsidiary entities that were under the jurisdiction of this physical entity, and that's what the 14th Amendment did. It redefined person as an entity of interstate international commerce. Now, by the expansion of the Interstate Commerce Clause, what it did was basically take a real entity, which is a man or woman, and create a vessel, which is a corporate fiction, and place these real people in this dead entity, an entity that has no rights. Okay? So that is why it's a criminal overreach. Why? Because it's actual fraud. Okay? A man is a man. He's flesh and blood. He's not an entity of fiction. And any time that man wants to remedy back to his real state, he can do so. That is, if he's conscious of what the government is doing there. Right? So if you look at the 14th Amendment, it says something, and I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but it says any citizen of the states, of the several states, is a citizen of the United States and subject to its jurisdiction. Because in those days, in and around that time, everybody were proud citizens of the state of Tennessee, or proud citizens of the state of New York. Okay? There was no such thing as a U.S. citizen. Okay? So they created a U.S. citizen as an entity of interstate and international commerce, subject to Admiralty Law, which is the law of the sea. Now, since, and after that time, if you attempted to use the law of the land in an admiralty court, and it's an admiralty court because you see that little flag down at the bottom there with the gold trim, that's an admiralty battle flag. Most of the time when you see judges pictured, especially Supreme Court, you're going to see that they're sitting in front of an admiralty battle flag. They're telling you that, hey, we are judges within the admiralty law. Now, how do they do that? Well, they put the water line on top of Long's Peak, Colorado, 14,000 feet. You're now considered below the water line. Whereas the courts themselves are literally vessels. They're dry docked ships in dry dock. And when you step on that ship, the judge, which is captain of the ship, he's God of his country. So what he says goes. If you willingly step onto his ship, he can do anything to you he wants. Now, if right, this whole idea of joinder, and joining, a joinder is tricking a man into binding himself to a corporate entity, right? And how do we do that? If you simply declare I'm a U.S. citizen, well, you've voluntarily given away any true rights under common or natural law, or those that were protected under the Constitution of the Republic of these United States. You voluntarily gave those away, and they gave you instead something called civil rights, which is the fictional complement to a lawfully protected right. Okay, so that complement is a fiction. Okay, I mean, it's no different from the rules that are written on the bottom of the of the monopoly box. You know, there's all these rules now. So, but you should have the power to walk away from that monopoly game anytime you decide to, and they're not letting you do that. Why? One, they're committing a fraud. Two, they're not telling you that they're using this fraud as a contract and using that by adhesion and your ignorance against you to trick you into you just willfully and unknowingly giving away your rights. And they're presuming you to have done so. Okay? Now, that overreach, okay, was criminal. One, because it was a fraud. Two, men are not fiction. And over and over again, here lately, this fiction has been used to usurp the protections that should be afforded to real lawful entities. Anytime you do that, that's a criminal act. Okay. So next question. What supreme mechanism provides a check against the three primary branches of the U.S. government that ensures that communist traitors cannot ultimately prevail over the people? Okay. Now, we all heard about the checks and balances between the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branch. And each one has specific powers that can keep the other two in check. Right. So if two branches believe that one branch is getting too much power, then they have within themselves, built into the constitutional framework, certain powers to keep those in check. But what happens when all three primary branches of the U.S. government decide that they're going to go their own way? Is there a check against that? And that's what this question is. Okay, so here's the answer. It was, again, from Lori Drabek. She said, the U.S. military using tribunals or court-martials. Yes, the U.S. military, most especially the Navy, because constitutionally the Navy was the only army that was going to be maintained in perpetuity. Standing armies are prohibited by the Constitution because without a declaration of war and without an immediate need, they're to be disbanded. So the keeping of standing armies was not permitted under the Constitution, yet we've had standing armies since the Spanish-American War. So how far off of the program are we? Oh, we're totally off the program. Okay, so let's see how that works. This is the military oath that every soldier swears to. Now, this is the current one. This has changed over the years, and it says, I, and you state your name, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Okay, now, in the law, first things first. Okay, now, what is his first duty? The soldier is to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Okay, that's second. Third is, and I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me according to the regulations and uniform code of military justice. So help me God. Okay, so now, what happens if your president is a traitor or betraying his oath to the Constitution? Okay, now, should be okay because first things first says, first you defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If you have a president that's not acting according to the Constitution, strictly according to the Constitution, then the first part of this military oath should take care of that. But it hasn't. So there's something else going on here. And that is, if you swear to defend the Constitution of the United States, remember that's the law of the land. The United States of America, all capital letters, deals strictly into the jurisdiction and realm of Admiralty Law. So can they even violate the Constitution if nobody even knows that they're not even using the Constitution of the United States, because that is the law of the land and they're operating within the law of the sea? You know, whose fault is it? Well, it's the people's fault. Why? Because they don't know the difference. They don't understand these basic principles. Now, let's say President Donald Trump hands the people a lawful republic back. How long how long do you think it's going to last before people who are totally ignorant of these concepts uh, lapse back into what we have right now? Oh, it won't take long at all. Okay, so there is a need for us to educate ourselves. Okay, so this question of the lawful nature or legal nature of our government is a pretty important question for us to decide. We certainly can't do that if we're continually being bombarded by and usurped by leftist infiltrators infiltrating every institution here in the United States. Including what it was to be a liberal. They infiltrated that. Why? Because liberals started out being incredibly nationalistic, right? Very supportive of the framework of the Constitution and the founding documents, and they were proud to be an Americans. That creates a huge threat if you have communist leanings and you're trying to infiltrate the people in the government. So the liberals were one of the first to go. Some of those older liberals a long time ago, I mean, they were completely nationalistic and completely supportive of law, with respect to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So they had to go first, right? So then, you look at what's happening at with the Democrats right now. I mean, what happened to all the reasonable Democrats? Well, they were infiltrated, and those people go away, right? So now what are we dealing? We're dealing with extremely radical Democrats who, one, will throw out everything that makes our country get great so that they can create some sort of centralized global government, get rid of all the boundaries. And you look at the caravan coming up here, and you got people claiming that they have the legal right to do that. Well, yeah, they have the legal right. It's a fictional. Illegal is a fiction of law. Yeah, all is fair in fiction. Do they have the lawful right? Not necessarily. They can visit. They're free to visit. But coming in here and existing in our territory, you're to be an American, and you are to know your civic responsibilities to all of those people that are in this territory. If you don't know that, then you don't belong here. Unfortunately, that's most Americans, folks. I mean, that's just it. Okay, next question. What amendment to the U.S. Constitution grants U.S. citizens the right to bear arms that 99% of the people who call themselves Americans will get wrong? Hint, the correct answer has two parts to be correct. Make no mistake, this percentage is a pretty accurate estimate. Okay, all right. Well, before giving it away, most people are going to say, it's the Second Amendment. It grants the right. Okay? Wrong. This one's tricky because it has two parts. All right, so let's go to the first part. Now this came from JF. I'm not going to say his full name. If you're interested, he's a public person. You can find out what his actual name is. He's a good friend of mine. He said, first, the Second Amendment. Second, it's bear arms. And thirdly, and most importantly, no government document gives you rights. Your plenary rights are protected by the Constitution, protected of that which you were born with. It's in the Declaration of Independence, which is settled law, meaning no one is going to argue against it. That's the first part. The Second Amendment does not grant any right at all. It does not have the power. What the Second Amendment does is protect your right to defend yourself. Okay, your right to defend yourself from the government. Okay, so the government is not permitted to infringe on those rights. Right? It's not a matter of the government granting those rights. All right, so let's look at the law. Declaration of Independence Preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? Now, why did I say unalienable? Well, it's actually unalienable, meaning that you can't file a lien against your property. Okay, those rights are yours, and they can't be taken away through the use of any kind of lien or sanction. Unalienable is something different. That is not what they were talking about there. They were talking about unalienable, which is a process where you file a lien against somebody as an attempt to remove property for exercising that particular right. Very different. I mean, there's a number of ways they started sort of creeping in this misunderstanding of what is in our founding documents. Okay, so if our unalienable rights are endowed to us by our Creator, I mean these inherent rights. If you were a man or if you were a woman, you have these rights. It's part of you. Okay, then isn't it interesting that this supposed, super intelligent man that goes by the name of Stephen Hawking, has pronounced that there is no God? Well, of course. For those of you who, are atheists, I mean, no offense, there are other people that have direct experience and know certainly that there is this Creator. Okay? These things are demonstrated in their lives, and they're attentive to it, and for them, it's provable within their own experience. Now, whether or not people realize that, that's up to them. But by coming out and saying, hey, there is no God, and expecting people to roll over and say, oh, hey, no problem with that, they've got a problem with proof. And certainly their convoluted mathematics in standard model cosmology is no evidence at all that a creator does not exist. Okay? So, but there are a lot of people out there that say, oh, okay, well, if your rights come from, some higher supreme authority, and that supreme authority doesn't exist, then you have no rights. Okay? How convenient. All right, next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's get back. Second part of that question. Okay, now notice that when in the question, I said U.S. citizens. Well, this goes back to some of the other things I talked about the expansion of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Is U.S. citizens are colorable entities, meaning that they're fictions of law. Right? They're not law, they're fictions of law. It's all born out of this concept or theory of legal positivism. Okay? U.S. citizens are colorable entities and have no real rights. No, they have something called civil rights. And civil rights are privileges granted by the prevailing authority, by its granting authority, and that is the Corporation of the United States of America. Okay, that's the entity under which, the jurisdiction under which citizens fall under. They're colorable entities. Because any part of a contract which is a fiction, or is colorable, means that entire contract is colorable. Okay, so if you're making a contract and you call yourself a U.S. citizen, you've now taken the real you and placed yourself into a fictional office, and the rules don't apply to you as a man or a woman. It applies to the office. And if you ignorantly place yourself into that office, then the rules apply to everything within that office. That's the trick they're using. Okay, the right protected. The U.S. citizens are colorable entities and have no real rights. The right protected, not granted by the Second Amendment, is that to keep and bear arms to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, infringement means you don't tamper with it at all, not even on the fringes, and that's certainly not the case nowadays. Okay, our rights our rights to defend ourselves has been incredibly infringed. Oddly enough, by people that a lot of people trust, like the NRA. I mean, the NRA, I heard made many arguments that, oh, well, people need guns so they can hunt. No, that's not why you have firearms, folks. You have firearms to defend yourself against criminals, against wayward governments. Although I do not advocate the use of firearms to promote constructive change in the government entities as they exist right now, because it's really not necessary. Our true way of actually solving this problem is by being educated and exposing yourself to the material you're being exposed to right now. Okay. Right. Most who call themselves Americans willingly identify as U.S. citizens, thus exclude themselves from that functional protection. That's not to say that the corporate government will not find it useful to play along with the ruse to make it appear that they do have that protection. You don't want to get the citizens riled up asking where their rights are now, do you? You might end up with a stampede, right? Now, civil rights have been under suspension since the Martial Law Act of 1933, because at that point they declared an emergency, and civil rights were suspended. Okay. Now, presidents have renewed that state of emergency continuously, including Ronald Reagan. So under that, the executive technically suspends all civil rights. Now, they're going to pretend because they don't want you all to like freak out. But honestly, folks, look around at what's going on in this country today. Are there any rights that have not been violated by the government as it exists right now? Your right to privacy? Your Third Amendment rights? Yeah, look that one up. That's truly what's going on with the social media platforms. They're violating the Third Amendment. All right. If you don't know why the Third Amendment is there, and we're told, the Third Amendment's really not that important. Oh, no, it is that important. That's why it's 3 and not 4. Because if you don't have 3, nothing in 4 makes any difference at all. Okay? So the whole idea is, in the question, I said, 1, the Second Amendment does not grant the right to defend yourself or bear arms. And 2, U.S. citizens never enjoyed that right, that real right in the first place. Okay? Because these things were created post-1861 and within a colorable corporate structure, governmental structure. Okay? All right, next question. What 2 glaring constitutional principles were continually violated by those serving in the U.S. Republic government when the Constitution was adopted in 1791, and that doomed us to suffer this current unlawful monstrosity we call government in Washington, D.C.? All right, now what does the question mean? There were 2 things. There were 2 things that the Republic was violating right out of the gate. Okay, and the Constitution was put in force in 1791. Okay, now, wait a minute. If the Constitution is the law of the land, then why was the Republic in violation of these 2 key principles? And were those 2 key principles important enough to take care of? Oh, well, yes, and let's get into the answer. Goodwill Prevail said, all answers can be found in Roger's other videos. Question number 6, right? Here's one of them that was being violated. Congress had the power of the purse, but not the issuance of money. Constitution said Congress had the power to issue money and should have maintained control of that. That control was controlled by the First Bank of North America. That was in place since I think it was 1781. Okay, and it had a charter under the Constitution of 20 years, or by the government for 20 years. So that coming around 1811, right, 1791 to 1811 was like 20 years. It was to be renewed. Well, guess what? It lost by 1 vote, and the bank wasn't renewed. Oh, bankers didn't like that. Because what did Amschel Rothschild said? You give me control of a country's money, and I care not who makes the laws. Well, what does that mean? That means if you have a foreign-owned entity controlling the issuance of your money, then your government has no power over that. That's why it was prohibited by the Constitution. But it just sort of slipped everybody's mind, apparently. Well, when they tried to take care of that in 1810 and 1811, that's prompted the War of 1812. Okay? Now, the second part of it is agents of foreign powers holding titles of nobilities in positions of power all throughout the national and state government, which was a direct conflict of interest prohibited by the Constitution. Who has, okay, and the question is who has, who holds title of foreign nobility is what it should say. Any person who has Esquire affixed to their name by passing the bar, British Accreditation Registry. Okay, Esquire is a title of foreign nobility. It's rank, right? You have a knight, you have a squire, serves the knight, a page, serves a knight. But this is rank in a foreign entity. All right. So anybody who has Esquire affixed to their name is technically has allegiances to foreign entities, and that's prohibited by the Constitution. Now, it was either 1810 or 1813 where the Continental Congress decided that even though the Constitution said it, that they wanted to affirm the prohibition of people holding titles of foreign nobility from serving in either the state or the national government. So they came up with the first 13th Amendment. Now, the first 13th Amendment specifically barred anyone holding title of foreign nobility from serving in the government. Specifically. Now, what happened then? Well, that coupled with the fact that they were trying to regain control over the issuance of money, caused the British, who were basically mercenaries for the banking, because they were totally beholden to the banks themselves. In the time it took for them to go and get that, get their armies together, they were on us, and we were fighting the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, some interesting things happened. They burned the White House. They burned specifically the 13th Amendment. They didn't like that. And they reinstalled the foreign-owned bank. And that hung around until Andrew Jackson kicked them out of the country right before Abraham Lincoln. Okay, and they stayed kicked out of the country until 1913 and the Federal Reserve Act. So that was quite effective. So one could argue, wait a minute, did we win? Now, a friend of mine, Michael Badnarik, who was a libertarian presidential candidate, which I'd talked to several times, he said, well, we didn't win the Revolutionary War, but we didn't lose it. Now, I kind of take issue with that. I think we did lose it. I think all they've really done for us in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 is make us think that we'd won. Okay, how do you implement a constitution and have two glaring, totally usurping principles not being enforced by anybody in the country? More importantly, by those in the government themselves. Okay, these things usurp. Okay, if you've got foreign agents in your government who are beholden to foreign power, making decisions for you, how long does it take them to get to a point where we have a situation right now? Okay, so then you look at the War of 1812, where and the first 13th Amendment that barred anyone from serving in government who held title of foreign nobility, that was ratified law because it was found in several state houses that amendment to the Constitution was settled law. That suddenly, after the War of 1812, everybody just forgot even existed. And although they have actual copies of ratified amendments of the Constitution, actual copies, but they just forgot. So then, of course, the agents remained in the government, and eventually it was just a matter of time before they totally usurped everything. It's not surprising. Not only that, but the bank charter was forcibly renewed. And we say, hey, the flag was still there, and we're yelling, and hey, we won the war in 1812, yeah, we're free. No. Anytime we truly wanted to be free, they pretty much, stopped it. But, hey, look, it's up to us to know these things. It's up to us. All right? These things are out there. If you want to do a search on it, you can find them. You don't have to trust me. Okay? All right, so next question. Oh, looks like we're done. So, few other things that's really important is understanding what your government is. It's very important. Okay? I have not, in talking with multiple federal attorneys, judges, counselors in law, law enforcement officers on every level, which includes Secret Service and Treasury. Not one of them has been able to answer a very simple question, and that is, by what lawful authority does the U.S. government derive its lawful power and authority? They haven't answered that question, and the real answer is they don't. Now, I'd love to make America great again, but I would love even more to make the American people great again. And that's done through an education of your civic responsibility. Now, Donald Trump at any time could be a great help by signing an executive order commanding the Department of Education under his executive authority to begin teaching the law, civics, and the true history of this country as it relates to its government. He could do that at any time. Okay. Now, either he is being influenced by nefarious agencies outside the United States, or he doesn't know. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he doesn't know. But there's something keeping President Trump from actually exposing this information. Okay? And we really need to know this stuff. Okay? We cannot have lawful government if we don't know the true nature of the government that's in place. Okay? So I want to just leave you with one thing. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm all for President Donald Trump, especially when he says he wants to return to lawful government. I'm totally down with that. I agree with him. But it's a little bit harder than I think we truly understand, because he can hand that over to us. But unless we have the power to protect that through our knowledge of both our responsibility and the law, then we have no capacity to protect that lawful government, and it'll be gone in an instant. Okay, so here are some observations that I've made with respect to what's going on right now. Now, this is right before the elections, and I'm watching the leftists and the quote-unquote progressives or the Democrats. I'm not particularly here to impugn any political party or anybody's support of any political party, but I just want to make some observations. Okay, what the left is doing, specifically the Democrats, is incredibly insane and absurd, to the point where, you have to admit, the Republicans present a reasonable choice. Given the absolute, blatant misrepresentations that are going on, the blatant accusations, the advocacy of violence against people that disagree. I mean, wouldn't a reasonable man conclude, hey, the Republicans seem like the logical choice, the reasonable choice, the sensible choice. Okay, yeah, wow, it should be a slam dunk, right? Okay, and then you look at the fact that people who are actively, right out in the open, committing acts that are thoroughly unconstitutional, thoroughly not in the interest of the people of this country, and I'm talking about people like George Soros. Notice that man is still walking around. There's no sanction. There's no seizure of any of his resources. And you look at Hillary Clinton with what she's done. Provably, she was involved with the Benghazi, including a number of things that rise to a level of incredible outrage and certainly criminal culpability. But she's still walking around. There's been no sanction against them. I mean, Cory Booker. I mean, literally, he's still in the Senate. Dianne Feinstein violating the confidentiality of a client and having lawyers just literally engaging in acts of malpractice with respect to Blasey Ford, and the fact that Blasey Ford herself committed an act of perjury right before Congress and everybody else in this country. And guess what? She's still walking around. You have to ask yourself, well, why, if the law is so clear, and why, if the law is right there, that one, you can't take care of the Department of Justice, you can't rein in the FBI, at least at the leadership level, so that they actually comport themselves according to the requirements, as they are required by their office. Why are they doing that? Why are they walking around? As I understand it, the Patriot Act says that they could be detained without charge indefinitely for acts that are considered terrorism. I mean, you sitting there, and if you look at the definition of terrorism, and you look how many prominent Democrats are advocating violence to the people in this, that is advocating force, criminal force, right, to promote a particular political ideology. That is the definition by the government's own words of what a terrorist is. The Patriot Act applies. They can pick him, send the U.S. Marshals, pick them up, detain them. And you can detain them after the election and even further without charge. Why? Isn't that the rules? But they're not doing this, folks. There are folks saying, "Oh, well, you just wait until the Republicans, take control after the elections, and then we'll see something happening." What assurances do we have as people? None. Right? So, if you want true open-mindedness, you have to think: Are we being herded here? Are we being herded here? It's important to ask that question, because the people that have been literally running this country ever since its inception, this hidden force behind government and behind our financial systems and even behind our religious architecture, these people aren't idiots, and they're not stupid. All right? They're certainly several steps ahead of the mob. And perhaps what the Democrats are doing is precisely what it is they want to do. Do you think they really care about their own party? Well, obviously not. They wouldn't be saying and doing certain things that they really don't care. Well, what does it do? It drives us to the Republicans. Now, are the Republicans our friend? Well, I don't know. Some of those Republicans are not our friends. And I think it's healthy to have a level of skepticism to saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is rigged here. What's the fallback position? Learn the law. That's the fallback position. Okay, we've got a caravan of people coming up here. Technically, qualify as invaders. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. Go ahead and read that. You'll see that President already has the lawful authority to send as many troops to that border as possible. These people qualify as invaders. Why? Because they're going to do harm to our country. How do I know? Well, they're going to come here and break our laws. Breaking our laws, it's not helping us out here, folks. It does harm to us. If you're not here, if you're here and you're not supposed to be here, and your presence here constitutes a breaking of law, Any of these people wanted to apply for asylum, they could do so anytime in their own country by simply going to the U.S. consulate and filing the application, starting the process. You don't just simply show up on our doorstep and say, "Hey, I want in. I'm being persecuted." Really? There's this whole thing is, okay, prove it. Yeah, and that's not to say that there aren't people there that have that don't that there aren't people that have legitimate claims to seek political asylum or relief. I'm all for that, but they're crowded out by a whole bunch of people who do not, and that's not helpful. They're trying to force the door here, folks. That's dangerous. That's dangerous because if a nation cannot enforce its territorial integrity, then it's not a nation at all. And these folks, these folks that think they rule, they're very smart. It's tried and true. They know how to usurp, right? Just look at what Suharto did in Indonesia. Okay, now this was President Gerald Ford that was involved in this. There was textile concerns that said, hey, we need some cheap labor. So Suharto came in, and what were they doing? Wow, under the guise of hunting down communists in Indonesia, they effectively killed all the Christians. The rest of the people, who were primarily Muslim, ended up becoming enslaved in these textile factories, working slave wages. That didn't work out for them either. They're good at what they do. And I suspect that within that crowd that's forcing our borders, right, trying to force their way in, that there are banking mercenaries embedded in there just to make our lives miserable. And we have an incredibly vulnerable infrastructure, both electricity and water. I mean, look at our transportation network. Most of the stuff that we get delivered is delivered by a semi-tractor trailer. It takes one bullet to put that thing out, and you've got millions of miles of roadway here in the United States that I don't care how many troops you have, you're not going to protect it. And you stop all the semi-tractor trailers from delivering food. What kind of havoc can that cause, right? Or putting down the electrical grid. Oh, folks, that's too easy, and it's a danger. It's a danger to have a group of people like that just suddenly show up at your doorstep and totally infiltrate your entire society. Hey, talk to Sweden, talk to Germany, talk to Europe, Spain, Italy. Every country over there that didn't enforce their borders is now dealing with gang rapes, thefts, destruction, vandalism. Are these people coming? Are they our friends? I don't know. They're painting swastikas on their on the American flag and burning it, telling that they're coming for our president. Does it sound like they're our friends? Probably the same setup. They're doing the same thing that they did to Europe, and it's coming here, folks. The central bank concerns anytime you have a large group of people unified to protect their right of self-determination. Anytime that happens, the central banks attack. And they attack using other nations, political groups, ideological groups, every single time. Divide and conquer, right? What was it? United we stand, divided we fall. I love what's going on with the black folks here in this country. Finally, let's all just be Americans. Finally, we've been waiting. Welcome. And wow, you don't necessarily have to be a Republican, but man, what I've been hearing from these folks is there's some people that are talking some serious sense. That's what I like. And how you vote is not important. How you think, your character and your principles, that is important. And that's not, that has nothing to do with the color of your skin. I mean, but look, folks, I mean, people are getting fed up with it. And let me tell you, this is not just this sort of time of, indecision, unknown. This is actually warfare, folks. The fact that it hasn't gone to the point of extreme, widespread violence doesn't make any difference. War is war. Okay? Our basic principles, our basic values as human beings, to say nothing of the United States, our right to self-determination is under threat here. Right? That's the danger. That's the danger. You have a right to determine what policies and what guidelines you're going to live, as long as you don't hurt anybody or create injury to anybody else. That's what's under threat. Oh, they want a centralized government. Why? Because it makes it easier to administer their livestock control management system. They technically look at you as livestock. Look at a cow. Do you think a cow knows the law? Do you think the cow knows what responsibility is? And folks, if you act like livestock, you're going to be treated like livestock. If you don't take responsibility, somebody will take responsibility over you. And by the law, they will have that power over you too. And they will tell you what to do. This is important. This needs to be shared. We need to have a dialogue about this stuff. And we as a people need to figure out what we're going to do. Otherwise, somebody else is going to tell us what to do. And folks, if you think that pulling your pistol and going to Washington is going to solve the problem, no, They haven't yet directly committed violent acts against us. Oh, they've used pawns. They've used stooges to do that. But they themselves have not done this. If we take up arms, we're in the wrong because we're the aggressor. Why? Because we have reasonable, nonviolent means of solving our problems. And it is incumbent on us to unlock what that is, that power within us. Okay? All right, folks, I think I've wasted, well, not wasted, it looks like it's an hour. And I think we're going to cut it off with that because, I mean, you can only stand so much of me. So you folks have a good day, and we'll talk to you soon. So, hopefully this has been useful to you. And, I just want to avert, any kind of, violent action or violent recourse. Okay, there's no need for it. I mean, this shooting people up and sending bombs in the mail, it's absolutely absurd. The protesting in the street, I'm sorry, nobody's listening to you because they don't have to. Right? And petitioning the government, yeah, okay, well, if that worked, then it would have worked a long time ago. I mean, how many, okay, so you petition the government, then they just ignore you. Let's do something constructive. Okay? There is a way of peace. There is a way of the protection of rights for every man, woman, and child on this. And this is an important part of it. Okay? Well, I'm Roage, and we will talk to you later. Bye-bye.